All right, Kaylee. Kaylee, we're live right now, and then I can just send the link.
We can also put more chairs on the roads. Do you guys need help? Yeah, do you make I'm hating Call Ava?
Yeah, it should. If you go in the email, I sent it. Wait, what's that? On your phone? Where do you want it? Yeah. How could I send it? How do you want me to send it to you?
Do you have our Instagram?
I do.
Can
Yeah.
you DM it in our Instagram?
Yeah.
Hey, if everybody could try to scoot their chairs into the wall as much as possible so we can pack everybody in. And then we're going to start filling people up from the front to the back with chairs.
I just DM'd today. Yeah.
Excuse me, can I get your attention? If you're in my ethics class, because we don't have enough room, I will allow you to go and watch it on YouTube so that you don't have to be here. Okay?
But if you want the chapel credit, we can't because of S or DSF. We can't give it out through YouTube, so you're gonna have to go to the live stream room, which we're getting that number in just a second. So if you want the chapel credit, but if you want his ethics class credit, then you can watch it on YouTube.
Yeah, and there's too many students, so I'm gonna, hey, you're my ethics student, so I'm gonna trust that you are here and you're not skipping out. So if you can't sign in the spreadsheet, the sign-in sheet, that's fine. All right, so if you are my ethics students, once again, if you want to leave because you can't find a seat or whatnot, that's fine. I just sent you the new YouTube link, so you can watch it in your room or somewhere else, okay?
Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, 228 is going to be the live stream room if you need the chapel credit and you are not sitting. So you can go to 228 and we're going to live stream.
Where do you want the camera to be for the duration of the event?
Sorry?
Where do you want the camera to be?
In the middle.
Live stream room is 228.
If you want to move to S107, it's unlocked now. I already talked to security and you can move there. And there's technology you can plug in. It's in the science building. It's right behind the you've seen about people down the stairs.
James, I need you to do a guitar and solo.
What?
Guitar and singing solo. Are you ready?
Right about now.
Oh, I'm ready for it, man. Dude, whatever you need, thank you. I'm your hands and feet today.
Is there a way you can slide that over here? Or just put that like over here?
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, guys, can everyone hear me? Everyone? Okay, so if you don't have a seat right now, if you're okay with standing, that's fine, you can stay. But if you want to live stream and get the chapel credit, you can go to 228. And so you'll be able to watch it from there and get the chapel credit. But we're going to go ahead and start with worship. Thank you guys so much for coming. I thank you that you are pushing through, even though it's really tight here. We really tried to get the auditorium and S107 and all of the other rooms, but this is the only one they offered us. So we're really excited to show that so many people are interested. So then hopefully in the future we can get a bigger classroom or just the auditorium, because that would be ideal. So we're going to open with worship. If everyone wants to stand, if you want to try to stand, I don't know if that's too claustrophobic,
All my life you have been so, so good. Every breath that I am I will sing the goodness you have led me through the fire. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. Every breath that I am able, I will sing the goodness. The goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, surrender now, I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. Every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness. I will sing of the goodness of God. from you are all things, and to you are all things. You deserve glory. Day and night, night and day, that incense arise. Day and night, night and day, that incense arise. Day and night, night and day, that incense arise. Day and night, night and day, that incense arise. Day and night, night and day, that incense arise. Day and night, night and day, that incense arise. Day and night, night and day, that incense arise. Day and night, night and day, that incense arise. You are worthy of it all. For from you are all things, and to you are all things. You deserve glory. You're worthy of it all. You're worthy of it all. For from you are all things, and to you are all things. You deserve the glory.
Okay, I'm gonna open this prayer. Oh, wait, sorry. Lord Jesus, we just come before you now and we just thank you that you are worthy, Lord, and that we can sing of your goodness, God. I thank you for everyone who has come here tonight. I thank you that we can just speak about this, and that you have given us your word that we can search. You've given us absolute truth that we can know, Lord. I pray that your Holy Spirit would just fill this place and that we would just have convictions and know what it is that is true, that you have made us in your image, Lord, and that's why we have dignity and worth, Lord, that we're made in the image of God. So Lord, I pray that you would just speak to our hearts and minds, that you would just speak through Ms. Connors, as she's just going to share the philosophical issues and just realms that reveal your truth. God, I pray that you would just help us to see what's near to your heart, Lord, and break our hearts for what breaks yours. And I pray that you would just help us to glorify you and have fruitful conversations, that this would just impact lives for the future. I just ask all of this in your name. Amen. Thank you guys so much for coming and staying, even though you may not have seats. This is amazing. I don't think we've ever had so many people show up, but we do have an amazing speaker coming. And so I first want to share the mission of our club, because I know a lot of people who are here maybe don't really know what Students for Life is about. And so this is kind of a short summary, but we really love, I don't know if you guys have heard of Live Action, but one of their mottos is love them both. And so that being the mother and the child. And so that's really our goal as a club. It's to educate and empower young adults, meaning students on campus, to go out into the community and help provide those resources that women are facing and men when they have unplanned pregnancies. And so our goal is not to have signs and be scary. Instead, we really want to be the hands and feet of Jesus to women and men who are facing struggles, and sometimes the hardest struggle in life, but it turns into the biggest blessing. And so we, a lot of our other meetings, we've tried to approach this from a biblical issue and a biblical worldview, but we have realized that oftentimes if we go out into the world, people may not realize that they share the same morals as we do, or the same convictions. And so the point of tonight is so we can kind of have a philosophical view of this and really understand what personhood is and how we can defend this. And also, if you're here and you're not sure on what your stance is about abortion, or you are definitely for abortion because you think that it's a woman's right, we are glad that you came, and we really want to have this discussion because we think it's important. All of us, we all have things to add. All of us have stories and things from our past that we can contribute to this thought. And just, I really hope that this will be a time that you can grow and understand, and even if you don't agree, but maybe you can be challenged a little bit and challenge us a little bit. So we just want to have that conversation and just talk about this. And as I was just kind of preparing for tonight, the verse 1 Peter 3:15 stuck out to me. It says, "But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience." And I know that's not in regards necessarily to abortion, but I do realize that as believers, and even if you're not, but this is kind of from this worldview, but if you're a follower of Jesus, that we do have to have reasons for why we believe that things that we do, especially with a biblical worldview and an outlook. And so this is an issue that is very relevant and things that the Word of God does talk about. And so I think that having this conversation, one, can help us better understand and be prepared to give those answers to people who ask us, especially if we're going to go out into the mission field or into the church, that we know and kind of have those answers prepared so we can share those with others. And so I don't want to talk this whole time because we do have an amazing speaker. This is Stephanie Gray Connors. She is a pro-life apologist. She has done international talks throughout. I've actually seen her speak with Tim Tebow in Orlando recently, and so that was really amazing. She has debated several people, I think from Princeton, and then from Planned Parenthood, things like that. So she really does have a great reputation, and we are so blessed that she is here tonight. So I just wanted to introduce you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel stuck in that corner, so I want to get a little close, except not right there. We have light shining on my face. Well, it's great to be here. I'm really excited to give this talk tonight because this is the first talk I've given with my baby, Ollie. So I am 6 weeks pregnant and very excited that Ollie is joining me. We always name our preborn children a nickname until we know whether it's a boy or girl. We wait till birth. So if anyone's wanting to get married and thinking, will I ever meet Mr. Right? I didn't get married till I was 40. And I have 4 babies. I have 2 in heaven, Lele and Mikhail, and then my daughter Violet. And little Ollie. So we're super excited to have Ollie with us tonight. At least I am. So anyways, I wanted to begin, of course, now that I'm a mom, I have slowed down the amount of travel that I do. But back in the day, I've been speaking on this topic for about 20 years. And so I was a very frequent flyer, flying all the time. And I remember this one particular flight I took. I boarded my plane and there was no one in the seat I was in. There was no one on my right, no one on my left. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. I can do what I love to do on a plane, which is start to read a book, fall asleep, and then the flight is over really quick. And just before the plane took off, someone decided that they wanted to switch seats. And so this man came and sat essentially right next to me. I mean, there was the aisle in between, but there he was with just that little space. And as soon as he buckled in, he's looked at me and he said, so what do you do? And I thought, oh man, this man is going to be a chatterbox. And he's asked me, a pro-life speaker, what I do. So I'm not going to lie. So I told him that I give talks on abortion from the pro-life perspective. And then I could tell by his muted response that he probably didn't agree with me. It's not that I got the sense that he was a staunch abortion supporter who thought it was acceptable in all circumstances, but he wasn't like a pro-life person I would meet who would say, that's amazing, I love that you do that kind of work. And so when he just was kind of neutral in his comments about my work, we started chatting about what he did and we were having just a regular conversation. But I felt in my heart like, there's an opportunity here. I need to engage this man on abortion. But I didn't want to get all weird and start debating him without a kind of natural flow in the conversation. And so I just began to silently pray, Lord, like if you want me to debate him on abortion, please provide an easy opening in the conversation for this topic to be raised again. And so as we're going back and forth, I don't remember what the man said. But he said something where it was really easy for me to respond to what he said by saying, so tell me, what do you think about abortion? And indeed, his answer confirmed my intuition that he was not on the same page as me and that he indeed was kind of in the middle. He didn't like all abortions, but nor was he willing to reject all abortions. He just thought sometimes it was acceptable and sometimes it wasn't. And so as we go back and forth, he looked at me and he said, okay, give me your best argument. So this evening, that's what I want to do. I want to present to you what I think is the best argument or the most compelling case that can be made in defense of the pro-life perspective. there are three things in particular I want to do as I break this down in terms of how to present the best argument. The first thing I want to talk about and explore is the concept of human rights and how that relates to the pro-life perspective. The second thing I want to reflect on is parental responsibility. What do civil societies expect of parents? And then the third thing I want to talk about is what are those hard cases that often come up in discussion when abortion is being debated? And what would the pro-life response be to those particularly tough circumstances? So I want to explore human rights, I want to explore parental responsibility, and then I want to look at some very specific cases that come up in conversation. Then please have questions ready, because then I want to hear from you in the specific topics related to abortion that you want to discuss this evening. In terms of what the best pro-life argument is from a human rights perspective, what I often like to do in conversation with people is ask a question. And the question I like to ask is this: do you believe in human rights? And in my experience, having asked a lot of people that question, you universally get the response, yeah, I believe in human rights. And when someone says they believe in human rights, my next question is, okay, well, who gets human rights? Now, it seems like a silly question because the answer should be obvious, but it's important that we be clear about what we believe and clear about what the other person believes. And often verbalizing our beliefs helps us really own what we claim to believe and helps us really think through what we believe. And so I'll say to someone, who gets human rights? For example, if children get children's rights and women get women's rights, who gets human rights? And I say, well, humans, obviously. And I say, that's correct. So then let me ask you this question. When do human beings begin their lives? Because if we can identify biologically or scientifically when a human being begins their life, then if we believe in human rights, and if we believe humans get human rights, then it follows that the moment we know whether an individual falls into the category of human or not, then we know if that individual gets the rights we believe in. And so, when does life begin? Biologically or scientifically, when does a human being begin their life? And the reality is, if you go to high school science textbook, if you go to a university medical school embryology textbook, you're going to see a universal consensus, a consistent message communicated, which is this: beings which reproduce sexually begin their lives at fertilization or sperm egg fusion. And when we're not talking about humans, that's not a controversial statement. Okay, so for example, if you're a dog breeder, or if you're a veterinarian, or if you work on breeding horses, it's not controversial to say a dog becomes a dog when the male dog's sperm fertilizes the female dog's egg, or that you get a horse when you get the sperm from the male to fertilize the egg from the female horse. That dogs and horses are beings which reproduce sexually, and the moment you have the gamete from the male meet the gamete from the female, you have the same species come into existence, but the next generation of that species. So you have something that would be genetically related to the male and female adults whose sperm and egg were brought together. But we know that it's a separate entity. It's something new. And that entity is going to have to grow and develop. But the difference between that individual and the parents begins at the moment of sperm egg fusion. So if it's clear with other beings which reproduce sexually, why do we often hear it not be so clear when it comes to humans who reproduce sexually? And I would suggest that that's often because emotions get involved. If we admit life begins at fertilization, then we have to admit we or our loved ones may have made choices or decisions in their or our past where we harmed a life that began at fertilization. And that can be a very painful realization to come to admit to. And so often we can move away from the intellect and argument and reason into the realm of emotion and dismiss that life begins at fertilization because we don't like the idea of life beginning at fertilization. We don't like what it means about our past. And, given that we just started this evening in prayer and we started in praise and worship, it's important to realize, especially from a Christian perspective, that We believe in a merciful God, that Jesus came because we're sinners. That if we claim we need a savior, we're admitting we need to be saved from something. And that's our sin. And yes, abortion is a sin, but all kinds of other things are sin as well. And just as we trust in God's mercy for other sins, and we repent and experience his forgiveness, the same is true of abortion. And so as we wade further into this topic tonight, I wanted to begin with that message so that if there's anyone here perhaps wrestling with a decision made in your past, that you know and remember that you can be forgiven and that you can find healing. And we can explore that more in Q&A if you want to talk further about that. But if we go back to this idea that beings which reproduce sexually begin their lives at fertilization, then if it's clear for dogs and horses, it should be clear for humans. When the male sperm fertilizes the female's egg, that's a genetically distinct new individual that comes to be. There's a really great scientific paper I highly recommend by a medical professor by the name of Dr. Maureen Kondik. And her paper is called When Does Human Life Begin? And in this paper, she makes the best case I've ever read for the science behind life beginning at fertilization. And there's many things she says in this long paper. There's one point in particular I want to highlight for you tonight. One of the things she talks about is that when scientists want to distinguish one cell from another cell, are these two cells the same, or are they different types of cells? She says scientists look at two criteria. They look at cell composition and cell behavior. In other words, what is a cell made up of and what does it do? And if you have two cells that are made up of the same thing and do the same thing, they're the same kind of cell. But if you have two cells that are different in composition and different in behavior, then we can conclude that they're different. Here's how this is relevant. Let's consider the composition and behavior of a sperm. The composition is the genetic material of the father. What's the behavior of a sperm? Swim around, find an egg, and fertilize it. Now contrast that to an egg. What's the composition of an egg? The genetic material not of the male, but of the female. What is the behavior of an egg? It doesn't swim around and look for something to fertilize. It just kind of hangs out and waits for fertilization to happen. So we can conclude from this that sperm and egg are different types of cells because of composition and behavior. Why is that relevant? Well, I wanted to go through that to then consider the one-celled embryo, or another term it's referred to as is a zygote. At the moment of fertilization, when sperm and egg come together, what is the composition and behavior of that one-celled embryo or zygote? The composition is the genetic material of the mother and the father. Even before the chromosomes have intermingled, once one sperm penetrates an egg, all the genetic material from both those cells have now come into one space or one cell. And so we know by composition at fertilization, we have something new and something different compared to what we had before fertilization. Then look at behavior. The moment fertilization happens, if another sperm comes along and tries to penetrate that one cell, that cell basically creates this wall and prevents penetration from happening, versus an egg where if a sperm comes along, is like, hey, come on in. But with the embryo, the one-celled zygote, it prevents, its behavior is to prevent fertilization. So by composition and behavior, we can therefore conclude even that one-celled embryo is substantively different from the sperm cell or the egg cell by themselves. So having said all of that, some people will say, look, even if there's something different at fertilization, it's just really hard to think that a grown woman is somehow equal to that one cell. How can we, be sad about the loss of one cell the way we'd all be sad about the loss of our mothers or the loss of our sisters? It just doesn't seem like these two things are equal. And certainly on the surface, we might see a lot of differences between a one-celled embryo and an adult woman, the woman who's pregnant versus the embryo in her body. But at the end of the day, kind of at the heart of the matter, Both are human beings. They're just at different stages of development. And a way to kind of wrap our minds around this is to consider something that I read about years ago that involves considering the nature of a Polaroid camera. I realize we all have our iPhones and Androids that we take pictures with, but you maybe recently have gone to a wedding and at the reception they have, those little Polaroid kind of disposable cameras on guests' tables. They're like, take photos so we can remember the day from your perspective. So if we think about how Polaroid camera works, you have that kind of boxy thing and a stack of cards, and you put the stack of cards into the camera, you point and shoot, take whatever pictures you want, and then that little paper spits out of the camera each time you take a picture. What do you see when that little paper first comes out? Black. It's kind of black and brown. Then what do? Often people shake it. We technically don't have to shake it. I mean, we're trying to get more air on it. You could leave it on the top of the piano here, or you could shake it. And then in a few moments, what do you see on that piece of paper? You see kind of what you had seen in front of you. Maybe it was the person sitting across from you. You see their face on that paper. It went from just being black to seeing their fully detailed face on the paper. So keeping that in mind, now let's consider the following thought experiment. Imagine you go on a holiday to where my dad is from. So although I've married an American and happily I'm going to become an American, I am Canadian. But my dad, I guess I'm following his path. He isn't Canadian. He actually immigrated to Canada where I'm immigrating here. And my dad is from Scotland. Right, so my dad's got a fantastic Scottish accent. Okay, that's right. He's actually right. He didn't come to Canada till he was in his 30s. So he's got a very thick accent. So imagine that you go on holiday to Scotland. Which anyone been to Scotland? Oh my gosh, there's like 3 people. I'm telling you, it's a hidden jewel. Everyone wants to go to like Italy and Paris, but Scotland is really awesome. Anyways, imagine you go on holiday to Scotland. And imagine while you're in Scotland, you decide to take pictures with a Polaroid camera. You just think it would be fun to be a little vintage in how you remember your trip. And so let's imagine while you're in Scotland, you go to a very famous part of Scotland that I was in just a few years ago, and that is Loch Ness. Have we all heard of Loch Ness? We all probably know the monsters in Loch Ness, right? Actually, my grandma, she swore she saw Nessie, even though my mom was like, she was blind and couldn't see without her glasses on. Yeah, out there, I see the Loch Ness monster. So imagine, you're on holiday, you're in Scotland, you're on a boat tour of Loch Ness, and you're taking pictures with your Polaroid camera. So imagine a couple hours into this boat trip, you look over your shoulder, and you suddenly see Nessie. I mean, all the humps, the bumps of this sea monster are sticking out of the water. So you excitedly point your Polaroid in that direction. You snap a photo, and the little card comes out. And so you're so excited, and you're just sitting on the boat, shaking it like this. And as you're doing this, Nessie goes back underwater. Now, you're disappointed she's disappeared, but you're not that upset. Why? Because you're holding the picture in your hand, right? Now imagine there's another tourist on the boat with you, and this person is from another country where they've never heard of Polaroid pictures or Polaroid cameras before. And so they grab the card from you to see what you're shaking and what came out of that box. And when they look at the card, they see just that black mark. And they say, what is this? And you say, it's a picture of the Loch Ness monster that was just above water. And they say, no, it's not. It's just a black mark. And they rip it and throw it in the water. You'd be upset, right? Now imagine you're Scottish and your Scottish temper comes out. Okay, right? Braveheart comes out of you, and you get really angry at this person for destroying the picture. And they look at you like you're crazy, and they say, why are you so upset? It was just black marks. Why are you so concerned about black marks? Now you'd likely reply, it wasn't just black marks. Everything about the image of the Loch Ness monster was captured in an instant. It just needed time to develop. And so the same can be said about who each of us is today, or each dog out there, or each horse out there. The uniqueness of any of these individuals who are part of a species that reproduces sexually, the uniqueness of each of those individuals, including us, was determined at the moment of sperm egg fusion, the moment of fertilization, We just needed time to develop. And if we value that picture because of its inherent capacity to show us the Loch Ness Monster, then we value it even when it's immature and underdeveloped. So the same is true for all of us. If we value a member of the human family, if we believe in human rights, if we believe we're all equal, then that applies to everyone who's a member of the human family, including those who are younger, less developed, and immature compared to others. Now, in my experience of discussing this topic, some people might say, okay, point taken in terms of something new happening at fertilization. But, if I think about it, like even if something is biologically human, it doesn't follow we should protect it. The real question is something a person? And only if something is a person does it get protected. And some individuals might say, just as you can have humans that aren't persons, so one-celled embryo that is biologically human and new and different from the parents at fertilization, but not a person, you might have persons that aren't humans. Maybe there's some alien race out there that's really intelligent and high functioning and they're not human, but we think they should have personhood status. Or you might be an animal rights activist. And there was once an article in the Reader's Digest years ago with the headline cover. It was a picture of a whale. And the title was, "Whales Are People Too." And it was actually a whole article, particularly about the sperm whale. And apparently the sperm whale is quite an impressive species. And it shows high brain functioning and some degrees of consciousness. And so there's this whole movement trying to get personhood status to whales. Now, I don't bring this up to get us to go down the rabbit hole of whether animals have rights and whether humans are equal to animals. I bring it up to make this point. The people, no pun intended, who are fighting for personhood rights for sperm whales, do they only want those rights for the adult sperm whales? No. What they're trying to do is get a whole species protected. Yes, the adults, but also the itty bitty sperm whale, the embryonic sperm whale, the fetal sperm whale. And if they're impressed that sperm whales can do things that, for example, ants on the ground cannot do, they realize that the embryonic and the fetal sperm whale maybe can't do what the adult sperm whale can do. But by being part of the species sperm whale, they have the inherent capacity for these higher functionings. Now, whether you agree or not about giving personhood status to sperm whales, I bring it up in order for us to then think for a moment about the human embryo or fetus compared to humans like all of us. The human embryo and fetus has inherently the impressive abilities that the adults amongst us have. We can think, we can reason, and embryos and fetuses inherently have those capacities, but they can't yet act on them. Why? Because of how old they are. They're just younger. And because they're younger, they haven't grown, matured, and developed to manifest those abilities in the present moment, but they have them inherently. And so if we value the adults of a species for what they can do, we need to value everyone else within that species, realizing that the younger versions within the species have the inherent capacity to do the things that people often consider impressive. So the person who might say, well, embryos might be human, but they're not persons, is thinking, well, the embryo can't feel pain at fertilization, or the embryo can't think at fertilization. But by virtue of being human, the embryo actually has the inherent capacity to think and to feel pain. But the embryo can't act on that capacity yet due to her age. The same is true for some born humans. If you are getting surgery done and you're under anesthetic, in that moment, you can't feel pain. That's the great thing about anesthetic. It takes away pain sensation. But you don't lose your personhood status just because you can't currently feel pain. Or when you're under anesthetic, you're not conscious and rational the way all of us are right now, thinking and comprehending what I'm saying. But if you're in surgery, we don't allow someone to kill you just because in that moment, you're not acting on that rational capacity or that consciousness. We know you have it inherently. And so the same is true of the embryo or the fetus. They inherently have the capacities. And so if we value the individual with those capacities, we need to realize we have to value preborn children as well, because the capacity is inherent with them. Having said all of that, before I move on to the kind of a reflection on parental responsibility, I want to address one other point related to this idea of life beginning at fertilization and human rights. And that is, in my experience, some abortion supporters will say, I don't believe you pro-lifers really believe what you said. You might claim embryos are humans at fertilization and life begins then, and they have the same human rights that all of us have. But at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, do you act that way? And then this is a scenario often given to test the pro-life person such as myself. So many years ago, this kind of argument or thought experiment went around the internet. And the person who first created it said the following: I want you to imagine there is a building on fire. And in the building is 100 frozen embryos and 1 2-year-old child. In this situation, you can only save the 100 embryos or the 2-year-old child, but not both. Who do you save? Now, most people, if not all people, would say, I would save the 2-year-old child. And if the pro-life person says that, then the abortion supporter thinks they can reply with, aha, you don't believe embryos are people. You don't believe life begins at fertilization because you were just given the choice of saving 100 human beings versus 1 human being. And you chose that 1 human being who's 2-year-old instead of the 100 who are embryos. So you can't really mean what you say when you claim embryos are human like 2-year-olds. So the question is that person's conclusion correct? That if we save the 2-year-old over the 100 embryos, that we don't believe the embryos are human persons? Well, to answer that, let's change the scenario a bit. I'll put myself in the situation. Let's imagine that there's a building on fire and I am given the choice. I can only save 100 5-year-olds or my 1-year-old daughter. Who do you think I'm going to pick? My 1-year-old daughter. Now, that doesn't mean if I pick my 1-year-old daughter that I think the 100 5-year-olds aren't human. It doesn't mean I think the 100 5-year-olds aren't persons. What it means is when human beings are in crises and they are forced to choose between 2 goods, save this group of people or save this individual, that there are multiple factors which may influence our decision to opt for one over another, such as an emotional connection, a familial bond, the relationship that I have with my daughter versus that I don't have with strangers. If any of us got a call tonight that one of our loved ones died, we would all likely be moved to tears. But if I say to you, as is a fact, right now, multiple people in Lakeland just died, I'm not seeing any tears. Now, it doesn't mean we think it's okay and that we should celebrate the death of multiple people in Lakeland. It simply reveals that when we don't have an emotional connection or a familial relationship, we might not experience grief in the same way as when we do. So all that to say, if someone chooses to rescue the 2-year-old over the 100 embryos, it could be that they're related to the 2-year-old and they just feel a stronger bond to that child. It could also be that they've calculated likelihood of ultimately saving the life. And they know if they take the 2-year-old out of the burning building, that 2-year-old will continue to grow and develop and live a full life. They may not have the guarantee if they take the 100 embryos out that the embryos will actually survive being outside the building because they need to be at a certain temperature plugged into the wall with an electrical. So they might just be calculating, well, I can get the 100 embryos out of the building, but then what? They're going to die falling on the sidewalk versus the 2-year-old who won't die. When we choose one group over another, we're not saying, oh, I'm going to go kill the people I can't save. We actually, in an actual situation, would try to save everyone if we believed all were equal. But we may not succeed in saving everyone. And the difference with abortion is that it doesn't say, hey, I think the mom and the baby are equal. I'm going to try to save both lives. No, it says, I don't think the embryo is even equal to the woman, and I'm actually directly going to go in and kill that embryo. Where no one would say, let's go kill the 100 embryos that are frozen, or let's go kill the 100 5-year-olds on my way to save my own toddler. No one who believes in the value of life would actually say that. Okay, so having said all of that, the second thing I wanted to address tonight is the idea of parental responsibility. If we were to consider for a moment, what do civil societies expect of parents? And the answer is that they meet the needs of their children, that there is no legal or moral duty to take your child to Disney World, although some children might say there is, but there is both a legal and a moral duty to meet the needs of your child: food, clothing, shelter, and love. If you go on the internet and you type into Google, parents starve, torture, harm, or kill their children, you will get horrifying headlines from around the world of just disgusting acts of abuse that have happened to some children at the hands of their parents. And I would suggest that whether someone supports abortion or opposes abortion, that both sides of that debate agree on something. And that is, in the context of child abuse, both sides of that debate agree child abuse is wrong. And it's wrong not just because an innocent child is harmed, but it's also wrong because the people responsible for the innocent child and the people who harmed the innocent child had a very special relationship and a very special duty to care for that child. And if both sides of the abortion debate can agree on that when it comes to born children in the headlines that we might see in newspapers from time to time, the question then is, if life begins at fertilization and therefore offspring begin their lives at fertilization, then wouldn't it follow that parents have a responsibility to meet the needs of their preborn children, just like parents have a responsibility to meet the needs of their born children? And just as we consider it a moral or legal crime for a born child to be abused and killed, we should consider it a moral or legal crime for a preborn child to be abused or killed. And it all comes down to then that first point about, do we believe in human rights and when do human beings begin their lives? But once we've established that human beings begin their lives at fertilization, that means parenthood begins at fertilization. I've always taken issue with cards you can find in the card store that if you're planning to go to a friend's baby shower and it's like, congrats, mother to be. I'm always bothered by those cards because then you give it to a pregnant woman and I'm like, a pregnant woman is not a mother to be. A pregnant woman is a mother. A woman who's not pregnant and has never been pregnant is a mother to be. In other words, one day she might be a mother, but a pregnant woman or someone who has been pregnant can never claim they're a mother to be. What they have to claim is they're actually a mother because offspring have begun, so therefore parenthood and motherhood have begun for that individual. Then the reality is parenthood, motherhood involves using your body to care for someone else's body. Because one of the things we hear in the abortion debate is the fetus or the embryo doesn't have a right to use my body. As someone who has had now 4 children in her body and is raising a 1-year-old child, I can tell you it is more work after birth than when you're pregnant. Now, don't get me wrong, pregnancy was not a walk in the park. There were some very difficult days, but I literally could just lounge on the couch, do nothing, feel sick, watch movies, whatever the case may be. Not so when you have a 1-year-old. I mean, when you're sick and you have a 1-year-old, like, put a smile on your face because you cannot just lay on the couch. There is so much you have to do to care for a born child. When babies are little, they can't even get snot out of their nose. And there are these really weird snot suckers that exist where you like put this suction thing and you literally are sucking up. Now, before you're grossed out, there's like this thing in the middle that never means the snot never goes into your mouth. But you literally have to use your mouth and your lung power to get snot out of someone else's nose. To change the baby, you're using your hands. To feed a baby, to birth a baby, all of these things, we are literally using our body to help someone else's body. Now imagine someone neglected their toddler, their 1-year-old child. Imagine they didn't feed the child. They didn't do any diaper changes. They literally just left the child in a room so that they were on death's door. Would we consider that child abuse? Yes. Well, what if the parent responded by saying, well, they had no right to use my body. I didn't want to use my arms to pick them up. I didn't want to use, my anything to help them in any way. And we would say, hold on a second. By the virtue of the fact that they're your child means you have to use your body to meet their needs. So if that's true for a born child, that's also true for a preborn child. One other way to kind of think about this point of parental responsibility is to consider the following thought experiment. We have Thanksgiving coming up soon. Now imagine you are thinking of going home, and then you go home, and terrible thing to imagine, but your parents are like, no Thanksgiving dinner, I'm not feeding you anything. Don't even think about opening the fridge. Now, we might be hurt, we might be offended, we might be grieved, but we can't call the police and be like, my parents won't feed me Thanksgiving dinner. They won't give me access to the fridge. But let's imagine instead of being a college student going home or wanting to go home for Thanksgiving dinner, you're a 3-year-old child and you ask your parents, I'm hungry, can I have food? And they say no. And day in and day out, you ask and they deny you food. You're now starving as a 3-year-old. If someone finds out about this and calls the police, will the police act on that? Yes. Now, what's the difference? Because what's the same in both of these thought experiments is the individual is the child of the parents. You, the college student, are a child of your parents. The 3-year-old is a child of the parent. But the difference is the 3-year-old is a dependent. The college student is not. And civil societies say when you fit into the category of dependent, where you're incapable of caring for yourself, that actually heightens parental responsibility. When you're independent, it lessens parental responsibility. So in the same way, then we have to ask ourselves, what is the preborn child to the parent? Are they independent or are they dependent? The reality is they're dependent like that 3-year-old child, which means as with the 3-year-old, parental responsibility goes up. The same is true for the embryo or the fetus. Parental responsibility goes up and they ought to care for the child. So I've said a lot. The last thing I want to do before opening it up to questions is tackle some of the very specific hard cases that can come up in conversation. And there's 3 in particular I will touch on, and then we can always dive deeper during Q&A. When it comes to discussing abortion, once we establish life begins at fertilization, the human embryo should be considered a person because of their inherent capacity to do the human things we all can do, like being rational and conscious. Once we establish that parents have a responsibility to care for their offspring, and embryos and fetuses are dependent offspring, just like 3-year-olds or 1-year-olds. Once we've established all of that, some people might say, but what about rape? But what if the child's going to be disabled? But what if the woman's going to die? What is, if we think back to my airplane conversation, the best argument I would give to someone like that fellow passenger, Dan? So let's start with the circumstance of pregnancy from rape. Whenever that question comes up, and it did come up in my conversation with Dan, I think the first thing that's really important for pro-lifers to do is to acknowledge that rape is a horrific evil, that it is an injustice. There are no words to describe how vile it is. And we agree with the person that we're speaking with that it was wrong and there need to be consequences for the guilty parties. Once we do that, a question I will often present to the person I'm speaking with is this: is it fair to give the death penalty to the innocent child? If we think about it, here in America, even in the states where the death penalty is legal, it's actually not legal for people who commit rape. It's legal or is a possible consequence if you commit murder. It's considered a life for a life. So if you rape and commit murder, then you might get the death penalty. But if you just commit rape, you're not going to get the death penalty. So the very people who are guilty, the rapists, the aggressors who have committed this horrific crime, if they're caught, in no state in America will they get the death penalty. And yet, if an innocent child is conceived who was not responsible for that horrific crime, in America, that child can be killed. So we're talking about giving a very severe life-ending consequence to an innocent party, something that we don't even give to a guilty party. I think another point we need to make is to ask this question: will abortion unrape a rape victim? Will it take away the trauma that has occurred? And that's a point that comes out in a story of a fellow speaker friend of mine by the name of Liana Rebolito. I encourage you to look her story up. Liana Rebolito. When she was 12, she was kidnapped and raped, and she got pregnant. And she was living in Mexico City at the time, went to the hospital, and when they found out she was pregnant, they offered her an abortion. And remarkably, at 12 years old, Liana asked the doctors, if I have an abortion, will it take away all my nightmares? Will it take away the feeling that I'm dirty, that no matter how many times I shower, I just can't feel clean? Will it take that away? And the doctor had to be honest that the abortion wouldn't do that. And in one of her interviews, Liana said, then I just didn't see the point. She said, all I knew was there was a life in me, and that life needed me, and I needed her. And so Liana decided to carry through with that pregnancy. But as the pregnancy progressed, because the time period was so close to the rape itself, she was still highly traumatized. She had a ton of horrific memories of what had gone on. And so she was so overwhelmed by the darkness of all of that that she considered suicide. And in one of her interviews, she said, the reason I didn't kill myself, even though I was haunted by suicidal ideation, the reason I didn't kill myself was because I was pregnant. And if I knew if I ended my life, it would end the baby's life. And I didn't want to do that. And so when I was speaking with Liana, she said to me, yeah, I saved my baby's life, but she saved mine. It was her very presence that gave me a will to live. And Liana raised her daughter, although rape victims certainly could choose adoption. Liana decided she wanted to parent her daughter, who became her best friend and was her best friend until her daughter was at 28, very tragically had a condition where tumors grew on her spine and seizures resulted in all these complications, and she died at the tender age of 28. And Liana says the greatest grief in her whole life was the loss of that daughter. So was the rape traumatic? Yes. Was the kidnapping traumatic? Yes. But the grief of losing her daughter outweighs everything in her whole life experience. So there's nothing quite like the power of someone who's walked down that path and can say, this was hard and this was brutal and this was terrible, but I'm grateful that I chose life for my child. The other hard case that sometimes comes up is, what if a child has some form of disability? And I think a question we need to ask anyone who makes that point is, what about the born people who have a disability? You know, you might have gone to Publix and seen that there are some people who bag your groceries who have a disability. Maybe they have autism. Maybe they have Down syndrome. Would it be okay if someone killed them now at that age because of their disability? And we'd all say, no, it would never be okay. That would be wrong. So if it's wrong now when they're an adult working in a grocery store, it would also be wrong when they were 10 or when they were 5 or when they were a fetus or when they were an embryo, because that whole time they were a human person. They were a member of the human family, different from their parents, just younger versions of themselves. And just as we may not kill a born person who has a disability, we may not kill a preborn person who has a disability. The final point I want to address is the question of, what if a pregnant woman's life is in danger? Some people say, look, if she dies, the baby dies, because the baby's dependent on her body to live. So if the only way to keep her alive is to do an abortion, wouldn't that be ethical? And so when trying to wrestle with that, again, as you can tell probably with me, I find analogies and thought experiments helpful. And so I think the following thought experiment can be helpful. Imagine there's a very particular path you take, let's say every Sunday when you drive from where you live to go to church. And you maybe go past like Hollingsworth, you do this turn and that turn, and then you get there. Well, imagine one Sunday as you're driving to church, it says road closed. Now, does that mean you're not going to get to church that Sunday? No, it just means you're going to look for the next sign, which says detour ahead. And you're going to look for that orange sign with the black arrow that tells you where to turn so you can take a different path to still make your Sunday service. Here's the point of that. It gets us to think that although we might be used to a certain path to get to our destination, if that path is closed to us, we can still get to the destination, but we have to go a different way. When a pregnant woman's life is in danger, the destination we want to get to is save her life. That's a good and a noble thing because she's a human person and we value human persons. We believe they have human rights, like the right to life. So we want to protect her life. What I would suggest as a pro-lifer is that there is one pathway that is road closed that we may not take to get to this goal of saving her life. And that pathway is abortion. We may not kill an innocent child to save her life. A way to understand that is if you need a heart transplant, it's not ethical of me to fly over to China and to work with the Chinese government to get some of their prisoners who are practitioners of Falun Gong and spirituality and say, hey, can I get access to that Falun Gong prisoner you have in jail? I want to get a surgeon to remove that Falun Gong practitioner's heart so we can transplant it into my friend who needs a heart. We would say, okay, wanting to save your friend's life is good, but the path of going to an innocent person who's been unjustly imprisoned and taking out their heart and harvesting their organ to save this person, that's not ethical. So in the same way, since the preborn child is a human, we may not kill that innocent child, just as we can't kill an innocent practitioner of Falun Gong, okay? So we cannot do an abortion to get to this goal of saving the mother's life. But we can look for the detour ahead. We can look for the other signs, the other pathways that get us to that end of saving the woman's life. What would that be? That would basically be identifying what is the pathology in her body. What is the underlying condition that's the threat to her health? And then addressing the pathology without directly killing the child. For example, if she has cancer and the doctors say it's life or death, we need to treat the cancer now. You don't go in and do an abortion and then begin cancer treatment. Instead, you say, first of all, how far along is this pregnancy? And if you're at 23 weeks, you'll say maybe, let's wait 1 week, let's get to 24 weeks, do a C-section, put the baby in an incubator, and then begin the cancer treatment. If she's maybe 18 weeks, you might say, can we wait several weeks until we get to viability to be able to put the baby in an incubator? And if the cancer is so aggressive and severe that you don't have time, you need to start treatment, you don't do an abortion and begin treatment. Instead, you begin treatment. And the child may or may not be harmed. Sometimes the baby could be harmed, but there are actually many cases where chemotherapy doesn't have an adverse effect on the child in the womb. But the point is, you're not giving chemo to kill the baby. You have, besides a baby in your body, you have cancer. And you're giving chemo to kill the cancer. That's very different from an abortion. Even if there's no cancer in the body, some people will choose abortion because the point is the abortion instrument doesn't target cancer. The abortion's instrument targets the baby. And so the whole point of the pro-life position is that we may never kill the innocent child to bring about a good. But there may be other things we can do that can still bring about that good thing. So to wrap everything up, I would like to leave you with this one thought I once read in a book called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. And in this book, you're asked to envision 3 buckets of water in front of you. One with hot water, one with lukewarm water, and one with cold water. Now imagine I put my one hand in the cold water and my other hand in the hot water. Now imagine I take them both out and I put them in the middle bucket. The hand which came from the hot water is going to think the new bucket of water is what? Cold. The hand which came from the cold water is going to think the new bucket of water is hot. The reality is they're both wrong. It's lukewarm. But the previous experience colors the present interpretation. So I bring all of this up because at the end of the day, kind of like what I touched on at the beginning, we can have all the just intellectual, rational, conversations about abortion that we want. We can be really academic, we can look at science, we can look at philosophy. But at the end of the day, we need to remember everyone has a story. Everyone's coming from an experience. And if you find that you're talking with someone and making a really good scientific case, a really good philosophical case, making some good analogies that I made tonight, and you just can't seem to get across to them, you might want to pause and ask yourself, what bucket of water were they in before I met them? In other words, where are they coming from? Have they had an abortion? Did they drive a friend to a clinic? Were they quiet when they should have spoken up? Did their mom or their sister have an abortion? And are these things influencing how they're receiving my message? Now, it's not that I'm suggesting you be overt with someone in such a conversation, be like, have you had an abortion? Because that's a very personal thing that could bring up a lot of pain. What you can do, if someone has been very upfront with you about their position on abortion, is you can say, I'm curious, where does your passion come from? Or how old were you when you first learned about abortion? And what did you think then? And what do you think now? Oh, I see it changed. When did it change? And why? And it's those questions that could then prompt the person to possibly share the temperature of the bucket of water they're coming from. That then explains how they're receiving your message. And that can then lead to some very fruitful conversations that can be ministering opportunities where you really just let that person speak and share their story and where they're coming from. So I firmly believe that we want to win arguments, but I'm also a big believer in winning people. And so I think remembering that thought experiment about the buckets is really helpful in positioning us well to be winsome in the conversations we have. So all that to say, at the end of my flight with the man, Dan, he said to me, I like you. You're not one of those wackos. And then he said, I don't think I'll be able to think about abortion in the future without thinking of you. And that's a good thing. And I leave you with that ending, with the hopes that as you speak with people about abortion, that they have a same sense that they've been provoked to thought, that you have really presented something to them that caused them to think, to reconsider their position, but that you do so in a way that is charitable and respectful and open to hearing where they're coming from and how they got to where they are. So thank you very much.
Isn't she so amazing? Most of the people that I told that she was coming from like the pro-life movement, they're like, she is the best pro-life apologist, and I definitely agreed. So here is, you can scan the QR to get the question and answer form and put in the questions like the ones that you want answered, and I will ask them, and we can kind of go through that process. We only have about 15 more minutes, and then we will be out of here. You'll get your travel credit, and yeah.
So yeah, please, so they just type it? Okay, type in your question. Don't be afraid to offend me. It's gonna be tough questions.
Hello.
The first question, I will go ahead and ask the first question. It says, what about birth control and Plan B? Are those abortions?
Okay, so just to repeat the question, for those of you who have to leave, I totally understand. Just want to thank you for coming. So appreciate that you attended tonight. In terms of the question, so what about birth control and Plan B? So if we are talking about things which end preborn life that is human and innocent, then I would suggest we need to be consistent. That the immorality of ending someone's life is not due to the method used to end their life, but is due to the fact that a human being's life has been unjustly taken from them. So the question then becomes, how does birth control and Plan B work? Well, birth control is a very broad category. It can include everything from condoms, which aim to prevent sperm from getting to an egg, to things like the birth control pill, which is a chemical you swallow and is supposed to suppress eggs from being released in your body. If we consider the birth control pill or Plan B, if you read the medical literature on this, it's described as kind of being oriented to suppress ovulation, to stop an egg from being released, to prevent an egg from being in your body, but sometimes that fails. And so if that fails, then one of the next mechanisms, for example, of birth control is to change the cervical mucus so that if an egg accidentally gets released, that cervical mucus makes it such that if the woman has sexual intercourse, it will be more difficult for sperm to get all the way up to the egg because fertilization happens in the fallopian tube. And so sperm has to get up the vagina, through the uterus, and into the fallopian tube for fertilization to happen. But then the medical literature says sometimes that fails. So the other mechanism of birth control, hormonal birth control that is to change the uterine lining, make it thinner rather than its normal thickness. And we know the birth control pill does this because women typically who've been on the pill versus not will say that when they're on the pill, they have lighter periods. And they get off the pill, they have heavier periods, which is indicative of the fact that when they're off the pill, they have a thicker uterine lining. That's what's coming out. And when they're on the pill, they have a thinner uterine lining. So here's the point. If breakthrough ovulation happens and an egg gets released, if the sperm is able to swim past that cervical mucus and get up to the fallopian tube where the egg is, then fertilization can happen. And in a pregnancy, about a week later is when the embryo who began his or her life in the fallopian tube, a week later is when the embryo implants in the uterus and grows. But if you have a thin uterine lining rather than a thick one, when that tiny human is 1 week old and is trying to implant in the uterine wall, the embryo might not be able to and could bleed out in an early abortion. This would not be recognized as such by the woman. It would just look like a period, but it's a possibility that that could occur. And so I would say that for consistency's sake, that since there's a risk that we could be ending the life of an innocent human being, then we ought to object to those things as well. In terms of birth control in general, that's a whole other presentation. I'm happy to engage on the topic, but because we're here talking about abortion, I should stay focused on that. I have blogged about it, though, on my website. So if you're interested, you can go to loveunleasheslife.com. loveunleasheslife.com. You can always contact us and we can send you the specific things, which also reminds me, I did bring some of my books, not that many, I didn't expect this amazing sized crowd. They're for $10. So I have a book specifically on abortion, which is what I spoke about obviously tonight, but I also have a book on in vitro fertilization and assisted suicide and the ethics of these. So if you're interested, those are $10 each. And then there's a book that my friend wrote called Why We're Pro-Life, just a booklet. This is free. Feel free to just take that.
Okay, perfect. The second question is, what argument would you make when people see the need of the death penalty but are pro-life?
Okay. Similar to birth control, I won't go too much down the path of the death penalty just because it's an entirely different topic. But I will say this, for someone who is in favor of abortion and against the death penalty, I would say, that's a very interesting position to hold. Because if you're in favor of abortion, you're in favor of killing innocent people. But if you're against the death penalty, you're against killing guilty people. Now, all the power to you if you want to protect the guilty, but it would really make sense if you're going to protect the guilty that you should definitely protect the innocent. Whereas the pro-life person is often, not always, but can be a flipped version of that, where they say, I object to abortion because I'm against killing innocent people. And they will say, I'm in favor of the death penalty because they're not innocent. They are guilty, and I think that death is a just consequence for the crime they've committed, which typically, as I understand the death penalty, again, I'm Canadian, but it's life for life. So if someone has taken someone's life, then it's the possibility that they can have their life taken from them. You're going to get a range of positions in the pro-life movement on this. I will say the position I hold is one of self-defense, that we in a just society have a right to use the amount of force necessary to stop an act of aggression. So if you're attacking me, I can use the amount of force necessary to stop you from attacking me or to stop you from attacking another innocent person here. So my position on the death penalty would be that I believe there are ways to use the amount of force necessary to stop someone from committing further acts of aggression without giving them the death penalty. So if they're already caught for what they did, they're already in prison, that's why we're possibly giving them the death penalty. We can use force to stop them from committing acts of aggression that doesn't necessitate the force of the death penalty. Having said that, if someone shares my anti-abortion position, but thinks it's still just to do the death penalty, the significant difference is they're talking about what's the right thing to do with someone who's committed a crime. And the big difference between that and abortion is no one's committed a crime. In the case of the preborn child, they're entirely innocent.
That's good. Okay, the next one that has the most likes says, you said that we should punish the rapist and not the innocent baby. As someone who has been raped, why should I be the one who is punished with the pregnancy?
Again, I don't know who in the room has said that, and my heart breaks for you for what you've been through. And I would never want to punish you. And I think what we need to remember is that the rapist is the one who has punished you, first of all, by creating that trauma of the sexual assault itself, and then the pregnancy that you didn't want. And I think when we're asked this question, why should I be punished? We need to realize the baby is already in the body of a rape victim. If we're talking about just in general, rape immediately happening and that person is pregnant, the baby already exists. The baby's in that person's body. And the baby has to come out of that body. So the question then becomes, what's the most ethical response? We take the innocent baby out dead, or we take the innocent baby out alive. And I think of a friend of mine who was raped. Like Leanna, she got pregnant, but unlike Leanna, remember the 12-year-old who carried to term, my friend had an abortion. And she said she's had a more difficult time working through the abortion versus the rape. Because she said, I didn't choose the rape. I didn't choose it. I was a victim. I was attacked. But she chose the abortion. And that's been more psychologically difficult for her. Now, it's not been the end of the story. She's experienced God's mercy and love. And also, I think we need to remember when someone's a victim of a trauma, that clouds their judgment, which is why people who aren't victims of the trauma, who are walking with that person, have a very grave responsibility to help them make the right choice. Because when we're emotionally overwhelmed and we're hurting physically, spiritually, psychologically, all of those things, we need people to help us make decisions that we would make if we weren't so influenced by all of those things. So there is a profound responsibility for people who aren't victimized to help the victim do the right thing.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. So the next one is, what is the pro-life solution to an ectopic pregnancy? As far as I know, there is no solution other than terminating the pregnancy.
Great question. So ectopic means out of the uterus, and typically that is in the fallopian tube. So as I mentioned, fertilization happens in the fallopian tube, and in a pregnancy that's functioning normally and healthily, within a week, the embryo moves into the uterus to implant. So in the case of an ectopic pregnancy, for some reason, typically because there's tubal structure or function problems, the embryo gets stuck in the tube. So the tubes, the little hairs in the tube don't move the embryo down fast enough, or there's scar tissue. Whatever it is, the embryo at the age it would normally implant, instead of being in the uterus, is in the tube. So then the embryo begins to burrow and implant in the tube the way it would in the uterus. But the problem is the tube is really thin, and it was not designed to expand and grow for 9 months the way the uterus is. And so as that tiny human being grows and develops, that fallopian tube expands and eventually will burst. When the tube bursts, the embryo is going to die, and the mother can die in that situation as well. It's a very serious situation to be in. So there are different ways that you can intervene. So I'll give you an example. If we think back to how do I get to church? The road is closed. Well, I just take a detour. So when you have a tubal pregnancy, you can do something called methotrexate, and you can do a surgery called a salpingectomy. So I would say, and I've written a whole paper on this, again, if you go to loveunleasheslife.com, I can send it to you. I would say that methotrexate is an unethical pathway to get to the end of saving someone's life in an ectopic pregnancy. But just because I object to methotrexate, it doesn't mean I say the woman will die. It's ethical to do a salpingectomy, road closed, knee to her head. We can still save her life by doing that surgery. Here's the difference. Methotrexate is a cancer drug that targets rapidly dividing cells. And so in the case of pregnancy, the rapidly dividing cells are what's called the trophoblast, which is basically the pre-placenta. The placenta is an external organ of the embryo needed until the baby is born. At the time of pregnancy, the placenta is equivalent to the heart. It's not like your hand, you cut off your hand, you'll still live. You cut out your heart, you won't live. The placenta is equivalent to the heart in that it's a necessary organ for the embryo. If you take a drug that targets that placenta, you're essentially directly killing the innocent party to try to save someone else. That's very different from a salpingectomy. A salpingectomy is a surgery that targets the tube. The tube is a part of the mother's body that, if left alone and ruptured, would actually threaten her body as well as threaten the baby's body. So it's ethical to take a part of her body she doesn't need for survival and which isn't designed for the baby's survival. The uterus is designed for the baby's survival. So you do a salpingectomy, you take that section of fallopian tube and you cut it out. If then we could transplant the baby somewhere, we would do that. We currently don't have the technology to do that, so the baby will die. Now, some people might say, well, wait a minute, if the baby dies with methotrexate and the baby dies with a salpingectomy, the end result is the baby dies, so aren't the two things the same? Well, when we're evaluating the morality or the ethics of something, we don't just look at the end result, we look at the means. In the case of methotrexate, we're directly targeting the baby's body for destruction. In the other case, and we have no intention to save the baby. The very nature of methotrexate is you can't save the baby. You're really trying to kill the baby. The nature of salpingectomy is very different. You're targeting the tube, and if you could save the baby, you absolutely would, and maybe one day we'll be able to, but it's a lack of technology that results in the child's death. So to wrap this point up, to understand this, it's like if two of you take a test and you both get an A. We might say, oh, that's awesome. Like, you both got an A. That's totally fair. But what if one of you cheated and one of you studied really hard? We would say, oh, we can't just look at the end result. We have to look at how we got there. And cheating isn't ethical, but studying hard is. So we don't just look at the end results when determining the morality of something. We look at the means as well. Great question.
So good. So our last question, Dr. Shin is going to ask.
Great.
Sorry, this one was going to take a while. So, I've heard the argument about about the difference between human life and personal life, and it seems like pro-choice advocates argue that their method of argumentation for personal life is always functional.
Yes.
Yeah, as in a human becomes a person only if he or she gains the ability to do something, reason, feel, whatnot. Could there be a theological argument for at least when life, I don't want to say personal life, so let's differentiate between a cellular life and a human personal life. And that human personal life can occur very early, but not right at conception. And this would come, and I wonder if two arguments can be made. And the main point is that human personal life begins when the soul is present. So this is a metaphysical, theological argument.
Right.
Not a functionalist argument. So, and I can kind of think of maybe two ways of approaching this. We can take it more like a Thomistic route and approach it with a substance dualist argument, that there is a body and a soul that can exist apart from one another, but the human person can put the two together. So there doesn't seem to be any indication that one body can carry more than one human spirit or one human soul. Now, many demons can be in one body. However, there doesn't seem to be any biblical indication that more than one human soul can be in one body. Now, given that twinning can occur, will occur several days after conception. And let's say from God's perspective, there's a zygote embryo that at some point will divide and become a twin, triplet, and whatnot. But in that, or let's say zygote, does it mean that prior to the division, that there are more than one soul in that body? If so, but that doesn't seem to be the case when we look at scripture. It seems to say one body, one soul. Now that's the substance dualist argument. What about something like an emergentist argument, who believes that the soul emerges from some type of irreducibly complex central nervous system? So according to emergentists, the soul can never exist apart from the body, but when there's enough complexity in the neural system that the mind emerges from complex neural activity, such as kind of like how electromagnetic fields will emerge from the Earth's core, the planet's core. They are distinct, but one is dependent on the other. So from an emergentist position, one could say that the soul, and therefore the human person, does not emerge until there's sufficient development within the cycle, so that maybe when there's neural activity or when the central nervous system is formed enough, that human personhood does not begin until then. So kind of given those two options, and they're more metaphysical, theological arguments,
Yeah, great question. So I'll start by just briefly explaining the science of twinning. There's two types of twins. There is what my mom is, and there's what my mother-in-law is. So my mom is an identical twin, and that means fertilization happened, one sperm, one egg, and a few days later, that one human being split into two. Totally random, no genetic aspect to that. Then there's fraternal twins, like my mother-in-law. And a fraternal twin is where two eggs were released. Typically, a woman releases only one egg at a time, but sometimes she spits out two, which means there's like, what, a million billion sperm every time there's an ejaculation. So those two eggs are likely to be fertilized. And indeed, that's what a fraternal twin is, where two separate sperm fertilize the two separate eggs, and then you have two embryos who grow from fertilization onwards. That, by the way, is genetic. So anyways, the point is, when it comes to identical twins, where you have one human who weirdly and miraculously and just kind of strangely splits into two, it creates this situation where some people say, well, then was there one soul, or were there two souls in one body, knowing another body was going to come along? So I would say the following, that we know there is one body at fertilization in the case of an identical twin. My position would be, where there's a body, there is a soul. That if it's a living body, that living body is being directed by the growth and development, is being directed by the soul. Someone might come along and say, no, I think the soul comes in sometime later. At the end of the day, you can't prove it. This is the metaphysical question. So then I would say, if you can't prove whether the soul comes into existence at fertilization, or when we're 40 days old, or when we're at birth, or 6 months after birth, if we can't prove when, then we got to err on the side of caution. And we have to say, well, if biologically we know there's a body that is alive and is a member of the species Homo sapiens, then we have to treat that living member of the species Homo sapiens equally with everyone else, just as I can't ultimately prove that, a newborn child has a soul. So I would say that. So then the question becomes, but then how do you explain this splitting of one human into two? Simple way is to think about a flatworm. If we had one flatworm here on the piano and we cut it in half, we would actually miraculously have two flatworms suddenly kind of crawling along this piano here. We would never say the one flatworm didn't exist prior to the split. And so in the same way, I would argue we shouldn't say that the one living embryo who's ensouled didn't exist prior to the split. It just so happens that some humans have this rare and remarkable ability, like the flatworm, to split into two. And so I would say, where there's a new body, then there would be a new soul. God can then ensoul someone because there is a physical body there to do that. Can I prove that the body's ensouled at that moment? No, I can't prove it, but neither can the person prove it when they say, well, it's at brain function. And quite frankly, if they're picking a point other than fertilization or the moment of the split, so the moment of the split for the second individual would be kind of like the moment of fertilization. If we think about those moments, that's the most logical position to pick because we know we have a new body and that body is alive. Any point after fertilization that we pick to protect life or that we pick to claim that's when the soul came to be or that's when the soul came to be is ultimately picking based on a degree change, not an identity change. Your degree of development has changed. The size that you are is a little bigger. Your independence is a little more impressive as time goes on. But these are changes in degree, but you're the same individual biologically the whole time. So therefore we should protect you based on your existence. Otherwise it becomes, well, why day 6 and not day 5? Why day 40 and not day 39? It's just a little bit more of development, whereas fertilization isn't a little bit more development. Remember, composition and behavior, it's an actual substantive change. We have something new. So where there's something new, we should say protect it. And at twinning, we suddenly have something new. Was it my mom or my Aunt Corinne? I don't know which one came after and which was first, but the point is new body, new soul. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. And then just real quick before we end, our 2 upcoming events, we're doing a blessing bag party on the 15th. We're selling t-shirts. If you are interested in going to DC on the trip, we have a meeting on the 15th. Here's an application for our board. If you're interested in joining our board, you can scan the QR. And then our chapel credit. We're going to pray. I know some of you guys are leaving, but we're going to pray really quick.